morning. My name is Derrick. How many of you guys remember the last time I was here? Raise your hand. Okay. Wow, okay, people remember me. Good, 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 good. Okay, so for those who were not here last time, my name's Derrick again. I grew up at this church. If you've been here for a while, Georgiana Ray is my grandma. I'm always going to say that. She's amazing. I work for a campus ministry right now called Crew. I work with college students at Cal Poly Pomona and Cal State Fullerton. It's been fun. Thank you. It's been really fun. So I'm gonna be bringing a message this morning. So if you have a Bible, let's open up to the book of John. John chapter 14. Okay. I don't remember if I did this last time I preached. I'm pretty sure I did. But every time I speak, I like to have like a minute of silence because I think there's something that really cool that happens, at least for me. So I spent, when I was in college, the 4 years I was in college, I was at a church called Isla Vista Church. It's a little church up in Santa Barbara that ministers to the campus. It's a pretty crazy place. But at that church, I think I realized that it was easy for me to wake up in the morning, come to church, and then because I'd been to church my whole life, church was a routine, and I knew what to expect. So I would come and I'd be like, okay, I'm going to come, I'm going to sit down, there's going to be worship, there's going to be a message, there's going to be more worship, and then I'm going to go home. And I realized that like it became habit for me, and I didn't take moments to stop and realize what was actually happening. And so before I preach, I want to take a moment of silence just for us to stop and acknowledge what's actually happening here. Like, there's a beautiful moment that happens when we're all silent and we all realize, like, oh, shoot, like, God's here. You know, it's not just like we're doing something for the fun of it. Like, God's actually here with us. So let's just take a moment, just whatever you're bringing in, whether it's been a good week or a hard week, like, I don't want us to leave those things at the door. Like, just acknowledge what you're coming in with, and let's be aware of God's presence for a minute, and then I'll get started. God, thank you that you're here with us. Thank you that as we gather together that we can be expectant and excited of your promise that where two or three are gathered in your name, that you're there with us. God, and will we just have open ears that anything that I say, that ultimately it wouldn't just be my own good ideas, but that it would draw each of us closer to communion with you, to going straight to you and listening to your voice and to your word. And ask that as we walk out of this building today, that we would be just excited for the reality that you're our Father, you're our friend, you're our Savior, and that we have access to a living God, and that would be the thing that drives us and sustains us. And so we love you, Jesus. Amen. All right. So when when Peter asked me to preach, he was pretty much like, you can preach on whatever you want. And when he said that, it's been interesting because I feel like over the last like year, I've pretty much had one message. Like I keep trying to preach on other fancy things, and every time God's like, no, you got one message. And I'm like, okay, I got one message, and the one message is Jesus. So I want to talk about the thing we wrestle with, at least we as in I wrestle with. I want to talk about this disconnect that I feel like I experience and a lot of us experience between what we know and believe and like what we actually do and what actually manifests in our life. Because I feel like for me, part of the problem is like, and I guess this is the problem of being human, is that because I'm good with my words, I'm really good at saying the right thing. Like if you ask me a question about what I believe, or you ask me a question about like how I live my life or who Jesus is, like I'm gonna be really good at giving you the right answer because I'm really good with my words. But the problem is that's a blessing in the sense that like if I'm trying to help you, I can give you helpful advice. But the problem is like I'm really good with my words, which means I've held myself a really high standard, and I don't actually do a lot of it, right? And so something that I challenge myself with, I was talking to the pastor I used to work under, and he was talking to me about how like I am so good with my words, and I kind of talk big game, but I don't always do it. And I kind of challenged myself to this idea of like, okay, I want to live my life in a way that if I imagine myself to be, if I couldn't talk, like if I was mute, would you learn the same things from watching me live my life about Jesus as you do from hearing me? Like if I couldn't say a word and you just watch my life, would you still see the same truths that I'm preaching coming out of my actions? And when I sat back to look at that and I looked at my life, I'm like, oh shoot, probably not. Because I'm so good at saying the right thing that I haven't actually stopped to see if it's permeating through my actions. So that led me to a lot of pretty painful introspection and some really good therapy sessions. So now we're here. Okay, so if we open up to John chapter 14, right? Part of where this comes from is like the essence of connecting our words and our actions, like the essence of closing that gap is that we have to realize that we're following a person, right? We're not following merely a set of principles, we're following a person. And the problem is the first thing that I realized when I stepped back and I was like, okay, what would people learn if I couldn't talk? The first thing that I realized is I think I was living my life like Jesus was dead. Like I was living my life as if Jesus was like, hey, okay, he was like, hey, I came down to earth, I gave you a set of principles, here's a book, and I lived my life as if he said, if he like died, ascended into heaven, and he was like, here I go, good luck. And I had this, and then my thought was like, all right, Jesus ascended, he said good luck, and now I got to figure this out. Which means my thought was, okay, how do I'm already like this. I'm already a very analytical, parse things apart kind of person. So I was like, he said good luck, and now I got to figure this out. And so a lot of my life was a lot of my own good ideas. And because I'm 23, they weren't that good of ideas. And so I backed up and I was like, even though I'm saying that I'm following Jesus, even though if somebody was like, oh, what's it mean to be a Christian? I'm like, it means I'm following Jesus. I'm like, the reality of what it really meant was I was like, oh, it means that I go to church and I had a set of principles and I'm trying to figure out how to do it, but I'm not living like he's actually alive. And so then I backed up and I'm like, okay, well, what, like, isn't that the essential difference with Christianity? Like, isn't the essential difference the fact that, like, the person we're following is alive? Like, even when you look through history, like, when you look at great movements in history, there's a trend in movements. You get a leader starts it, the leader gets a massive followers, it gets a lot of traction, the leader dies, and within some amount of time, the movement either dies or so diversifies that it loses its identity because the leader's no longer there to define it. And what scared me is that when I looked at the church, it doesn't look a whole lot different. Like, when I looked at the church, I was like, what happened was Jesus came, he built all these followers, he died, And then I'm like, afterwards, it feels like there was this, and this is totally human, which I'm not saying is necessarily bad, because I'm like, this is just what it's like to be human, but it feels like there was this tension of like, oh, he's gone, like, oh my God, we got to figure this out. Which is why we now literally have like 40 or 50,000 denominations, right, in the world, is because we all got really tense. We were like, oh my God, he's gone. And we're like, we got to figure it out. And I feel like the thing that pulled me back was as I like sat and read through the scriptures, I'm like, the whole promise is he's like, I'm still alive. Like, if you listen to me, I'm here. So when we read in John 14, right, if we're going to live like Jesus is alive, right, if we're going to live like he's with us, when you read in John 14, Jesus says, oh, sorry, not John 14. Good Lord, I can't even read my notes. John chapter 5. Got you. If we read in John chapter 5, verse 19, right, it says, therefore Jesus answered and was saying to them, truly, truly, I say to you, the Son can do nothing of himself unless it is something he sees the Father doing. For whatever the Father does, these things the Son also does in like manner. For the Father loves the Son and shows him all things that he himself is doing, and the Father will show him greater works than these, so that you will marvel. Not marvel, marvel. Same thing. Okay, so here's why I'm reading this. Okay, so Jesus is saying, he's saying, look, like, I came down here, and he's going, I only do what I see my Father doing, right? And then, now here we go. Now John chapter 14, right? Then later on, keep this in your mind. Jesus saying, I'm only doing what the Father says I'm doing, right? And then later on in John chapter 14, Jesus is like, in the beginning of John chapter 14, Jesus is basically like, hey, I've got a place for you somewhere else, and I'm going to go to it. And the disciples are like, what in the world are you talking about? And he's like, I'm going to go. And they're like, where are you going? And he says, no. He says in verse 16, right? He says, I will ask the Father, and he will give you another helper, that he may be with you forever, that is the Spirit of truth, whom the world cannot receive, because it does not see him or know him. But you know him, because he abides with you and will be in you. I will not leave you as orphans. I will come to you. After a little while, the world will no longer see me, but you will see me. Because I live, you will live also. That last sentence I'm going to read again. After a little while, the world will no longer see me, but you will see me. Because I live, you will live also. Okay, so, right, Jesus is here, and he's like, while I'm on earth, my mode of operating is I'm going to look at the Father, and whatever the Father's doing, I'm going to just do that. And then he says, but the problem is I'm going to leave. And when I leave, the disciples are like, we can't do this without you. And Jesus is like, okay, I'm going to leave, but I'm not really leaving because I'm going to come back and I'm going to be with you. And they're like, what the heck, right? So the biggest shift that happened for me is this last sentence pretty much haunted me. Jesus says, because I live, you will live also. I think the thing that like hit me really hard was, I think when you listen to my words, I was saying that like I was alive because Jesus is alive. But if you looked at my actions, like my actions were basically saying that because Jesus died, I'm not dead, which there was a huge difference. And let me bring this difference out. The difference was when I sat there and I was like, okay, because Jesus died for me, I'm not dead. I was living with this like survival mentality. Like I was living with this, if I could just huddle in the sanctuary till Jesus comes back, I'm going to be okay, right? I was living with this, I'm a miserable person, but because Jesus died for me, like, I'm not that miserable. Which, the problem with that thinking was that when Jesus commissions us to go out in the world and be his hands and feet, to be salt and light, to be alive in him, when he says he's promising us abundant life, I'm like, I wasn't experiencing abundant life. Because I completely forgot that Jesus was like, hey, I'm alive and living in you. And I was just thinking like, okay, well, at least I'm not dead. So the thing that I want us to get out of this is like, when we're looking at Jesus, right, the whole goal is that we're following a person who's alive, and he's like, come do as I do. Like, what it essentially means to be a disciple, right, is that you're looking at the person that you're following and you're saying, teach me to do what you do. Let me give you just like a real quick framework, right? When you're talking about rabbis, right, in first century Jewish world, right, there's basically 3 stages of following your rabbi, right? There's to be with your rabbi. So basically, as a disciple of the rabbi, you would just follow the rabbi around and just watch him do everything he does, right? And then in that process, it was to become like your rabbi, right? So the rabbi would be like, hey, follow me around. And for years, you just follow your rabbi around watching him do it. And then the rabbi is going to be like, okay, hey, let me teach you to do what I'm doing. And so the goal is that by the time that the rabbi you're a disciple of, by the time he dies, you can do as your rabbi did, right? This is just apprenticeship 101. This is the same thing that's happening with Jesus. It's like linguistically, when Jesus is like, hey, you're my disciples, Jesus is saying, be with me so you can become like me so you can do as I did. But that's not what I was doing. What I was doing in my life was I was like, oh, I'm just supposed to believe the right thing about you, and I'm just supposed to like stand back and sit down and be like, okay, well, at least I'm not dead. And I was like, wait a second, that's not abundant life. Like, what am I doing? I'm supposed to be salt and light. So this brought up a whole nother can of worms, because now I'm sitting here and now I'm like, what? Like, I'm supposed to become like Jesus and do what with what and what? Like, I don't even know how to do my laundry, right? And so, well, I do now. Don't judge me. Okay, so I'm like, I'm sitting there, I'm like, what the heck does this even mean? And so then, all right, flip with me to Ephesians 5. We're going to do a lot of flipping. I'm a big fan of flipping all over the Bible when I preach, so we'll get fast. Okay, so flip to Ephesians 5, right? Ephesians 5, I'm going to give you 1 second. Ephesians 5, verse 1. I'm going to read this one real quick. Ephesians 5, verse 1 says, therefore be imitators of God as beloved children, and walk in love, just as Christ also loved you, and gave himself up for us, an offering and a sacrifice to God as a fragrant aroma. Okay, I'm going to read that again. Therefore be imitators of God as beloved children, and walk in love, just as Christ also loved you and gave himself up for us, an offering and a sacrifice to God as a fragrant aroma. Okay. Be imitators of God as beloved children. So, this idea of imitating God, this is the same. Where did we just hear this? We just heard Jesus say this. Jesus just said, I look at the Father and I do what the Father's doing. And then Paul here is saying, do the same thing. Like, don't try to make it up, right? Jesus didn't say good luck. Paul said, look at what Jesus is doing and do as he does. Look at what the Father's doing and do as he does. So it helps for me to like pull this into practical examples. So as a lot of you know, I'm a worship leader, and I was a worship leader up in Santa Barbara. And the other day, a student in Santa Barbara who was there when I was there, a student in Santa Barbara sent me a video of one of their friends imitating me singing. And it was probably the funniest video I've ever seen because it was really accurate. And I was looking at it, and this is a kid, like, I didn't really know him very well. I probably talked to him 2 or 3 times, but he had been to the ministry I was in every week and heard me sing every week. And he was really good at imitating me. And I sat there, and I think it's moments like that where it clicked of like what this actually means of imitating God. Because part of it is like we could take this as a very poetic verse of like, oh, I'm supposed to imitate God, and like, what, right? Like, I can't just go creating worlds and stuff like that. That's not what it means, right? So I'm thinking like, what does it actually mean to imitate God? Okay, I'm going to take you to a different verse, and it's going to sound unrelated, and then I'm going to connect it, and then we're going to go home. Okay. Flip to Isaiah. Yeah, we're going there. We're going backwards. Old Testament. Isaiah, by the way, is my favorite book in the Bible, so we're going to be there. Okay, flip to Isaiah, chapter 56. All right, here we go. I'm going to give you a second because I'm going to read a couple verses of it, and then we're going to connect it, and it's going to be fantastic. All right, so keep this in your mind. Keep imitating God in your mind, right? The goal here is to sit with God as a child and imitate him. Okay, we're going to go back to Isaiah 56 because God's been, okay, when you look through the Bible, the stuff I'm saying, he's been saying the same thing for a long time. Like the same stuff Jesus is talking about, God's already saying back when he's speaking through Isaiah, right? So Isaiah 56, verse 1 says, "Thus says the Lord, preserve justice and do righteousness, for my salvation is about to come and my righteousness to be revealed. How blessed is the man who does this, and the Son of Man who takes hold of it, who keeps from profaning the Sabbath and keeps his hand from doing any evil." Okay, flip a page over. Go to Isaiah 58, verse 13. If because of the Sabbath, all right, let's remember what the Sabbath is, right? The Sabbath is you stop work to have a whole day, basically to be with the Lord. Okay. Isaiah 58, verse 13. If because of the Sabbath, right, if because of spending a day with the Lord, you turn your foot from doing your own pleasure on my holy day and call the Sabbath a delight, the holy day of the Lord honorable, and honor it, desisting from your own ways, from seeking your own pleasure and speaking your own word, then you will take delight in the Lord, and I will make you ride on the heights of the earth, and I will feed you with the heritage of Jacob your father, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. Okay, here we go. We're going to connect this. So, in Ephesians, right, we're talking about imitating God as children. Then in John, Jesus is saying, I only do what my Father's doing, right? So we're talking about this idea of looking at Jesus, looking at the Father, and becoming like him. In Isaiah, God is saying, he's making it pretty simple. He said, basically for the righteous man, he's like, keep the Sabbath and do righteousness. So let's be careful here, okay? And here's why I want us to be careful, is it's easy to read the Bible and we have this subconscious lens of like, just tell me what to do, right? Because we so desperately want to know we're right that the human tendency is like, just tell me what to do. And so it's easy to think, you read this and go, God's saying, hey, just keep the Sabbath and do righteousness, and your joy will spring forth. And that part of my brain is saying like, okay, I just got to have a Sabbath and don't do anything wrong. But we're missing a significant part of this, because what is God's heart behind what he's saying? Like the substance behind keep the Sabbath and do righteousness, right? The substance behind it is God is saying, stop doing your own thing just for a day and just sit with me. Just be with me. Just be. Like, the essence of the Sabbath is it's not that you don't work just for the sake of not working. God's saying don't work, he's like, take your hands off of what you're doing just for a day so that you can remember that I'm the one that actually sustains you. He's saying like, all I want is if you just spend a day out of your week, right? And this is to the Israelites. He's saying, just take one day, right? Which you can bring that into our current context where he's like, just don't watch TV for an hour and just spend time with me instead, right? Like, he's saying if you spend time with me, and when he says do righteousness, right? Spend time with me and do what I'm asking you to do because I love you. He's like, then your righteousness is going to spring forth. So, when I back up from that, I'm thinking, like, okay, what filter is God asking me to look at life through? And the filter that he's asking me to look at it through is when he says imitate God, you can't imitate somebody that you don't spend time with. Like, the kid who sent me a video of him imitating my singing, he can only imitate my singing because he heard me sing for a year. If you've never heard me sing and I said, go imitate my singing, you can't do it, right? And so part of what God's saying is he's like, in order for us to imitate God as beloved children, you have to spend time with him. There's no other way to do it. And God's saying, remember, the beauty of the gospel is I'm alive. Come sit with me. Just be. Which is, if I'm honest, like probably the hardest thing for me. Because I'm so like, go, go, go productivity. Which means when I sit down before God, I'm like, go, go, go. And then I sit down before God and I'm like, okay, God, like, and I'm just like praying about all this stuff. I'm like, I need a message for Sunday and like help me with this situation. And I need to figure out how to do this and I need to do this and bless this person and amen. And then I'm out. And that, if I'm honest, like, that's what started to cause me a lot of problems, is because I was going to God and I was like, okay, God, you're God, here's everything I need, and then I'm out. And God was, every single time, God was like, just sit. Like, just sit with me. Because I started to realize that if I'm supposed to be following Jesus, and if I'm supposed to be salt and light in the earth, if I'm supposed to be imitating God, I started to realize that if I stopped talking and you just looked at my actions, like, you wouldn't see it. Because I didn't understand, like, I hadn't spent time with Jesus in a way where I knew what he was like. I had only read the Bible and thought, like, oh, I know what God wanted. He wants me to do good things. You know, church said, don't do drugs. And I was like, that's okay, I'm good at that. And then I'm fine, right? But the reality is there's, like, if we're honest, there's a million things in life that this doesn't tell you what to do with, right? Like, this tells me the filter by which to view my life. This tells me how to find the person I'm following. But, like, when I'm asking really hard questions, right? Like, if I'm asking stuff like, oh, you know, what's the right policy to vote on? What is, like, in my marriage, how am I supposed to talk to my wife? Like, am I supposed to have my kids eat organic food? Am I supposed to eat not organic food? Like, I don't have kids. I don't know why I'm talking about kids. Like, am I supposed to eat organic food? Like, what? There's so many questions that I'm like, is recycling, like, mandated by Jesus? Like, there's so many things that, like, practically, like, you can glean ideas. You're like, recycling's probably a good thing. But the Bible doesn't tell you, like, hey, recycle, right? There's no reduce, reuse, recycle in the Bible, right? So the thing is like, I have to then be, so here's what I'm going to close with. Like, here's the framework that I have to now rework is, and this is like the only message I've had for a long time, is that I think a lot of times we get this feeling, right, that if we read through the Bible and if we come to church and if we can figure out how to do the right things, right, if we're like, if I just figure out, like, if I come to church every Sunday, if I, you know, give to the poor, if I'm doing this stuff, then, like, I'm going to be good. And the problem is like, what Jesus is asking of us is he's saying, like, I don't necessarily just want you to do the right thing. He's like, I want you to become the type of person that would do the right thing. Let me rephrase this. Jesus is saying, I don't want you to just do what I tell you. He's saying, I want you to become like me so that you're the type of person that would do what I want. Because the filter that I'm now living my life through is like, I'm living my life through a filter of like, everything I do to make God smile. Right? I'm thinking like, what's going to make him smile? Because I can sit here all day long and lay down a list of rules for what I'm supposed to do, but if I'm going to be honest, like, I'm not really good. Like, I'm never going to do all that. We've already seen it happen, right? Jesus gave the Israelites like 613 laws. They couldn't do that. And so, at the end of the day, our goal as followers of Jesus is to sit with Jesus, to become like Jesus, to do as he did. And if there's anything that you take away from what I'm saying this morning, is that, like, if you've noticed, I have not given you any answers. Like, I have not said, like, okay, church, here's what you go do this week. Have a blessed week. Right? Like, this is not what I've said. Like, I've given you no answers. I've basically just given you a bunch of problems and then been like, okay, go sit with an invisible person. Right? Is pretty much what I just said. But it's the reality. Like, the reality is that Jesus so permeates our soul when we allow ourselves to become like him. And we're no longer thinking, oh gosh, how do I not sin? Because the goal is no longer how do I not sin. The goal is how do I become a person with a character that's so like Jesus that just as Jesus didn't have even an option to sin, like in my mind, I don't have the option. Because that's the type of person I am. So, as we go, one of my favorite things that the pastor I used to work under would tell me, he'd tell me the gospel is an as you go gospel. You know, when Jesus says, go make disciples of all nations, he would say, it's as you go. So he's like, as you go to the grocery store, as you go to the pharmacy, as you're in your house, share the good news. right? So as we go, don't get so caught up in merely going that we forget to sit. Because Jesus already gave us the example. Jesus would go out with a bunch of crowds, right? And he'd have a whole crowd. I'm gonna give you a quick illustration, right? And then I'm gonna literally walk off stage because I have a tendency to talk too long. Okay, so Jesus would come to crowds, he'd preach to them, and they'd be like, "Oh my gosh, who is this guy?" And then Jesus would literally be like, "Later," and like just walk up a mountain and be alone. And the disciples would be like, and Jesus is like, "Hey, I gotta go be alone," which is like, how weird, like let's be real, how weird would it be if I was in the middle of my message, right? And I'm like talking to you guys, and I'm like here, right? And you guys are like all into it, and you're like, "Oh my gosh, like this is so good, like tell me more." And I'm like, "Hey, I have really good news for you, like there's eternal life for you." And you're like, "Oh my gosh, where is it?" And I'm like, "Okay, I'm gonna have to go be with Jesus right now. I'll see you guys later." And you just left with an empty stage and my voice booming, right? Like, but this is what Jesus did, because Jesus is like, I can't do this if I don't sit with my Father, because I only do what my Father's doing. And this is the same thing we got to do, guys. Like, as believers, everything we do has to first come from sitting alone with Jesus and then going out. If we try to just keep going and don't stop in the process, we're going to miss it. Okay. That was a lot. Are we okay? We're okay. Okay, I'm going to pray. Here we go. God, thank you so much that you haven't left us alone, that you've brought us into a family where you're alive and you're teaching us and you're with us. God, that you remind us of just the beautiful reality of you being so close, that it reminds me of in Isaiah when there's a promise that there will be a day when you hear a voice behind you that says, "This is the way, walk in it," when you turn to the right or to the left, and that promise is what we get to enjoy now. God, thank you that your Spirit is there to guide us, that we're not left to our own devices. And God, even in my own life, I just say I'm sorry for the ways that I've attempted to figure it out by myself and not asked you when you're ready with wisdom and with love. God, would you, all of us in this room, God, would you just teach us to be people who just consistently ask you questions, ask for guidance, but also learn to just sit. God, that we would not always come to you with an agenda, but we would come to you just to enjoy you, that we would love you, that we would care for you, that we would desire to bring joy to your heart. Yeah, thank you, God, that we get the joy of abiding in you. We love you, Jesus. Amen.